Breakfast with the Bible. Something to munch on. Welcome to episode 13 of Breakfast with the Bible, a podcast where we work our way through the Bible one bite at a time. My name is Dan, and today we are studying John 2:13 through 17, which reads, "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, and the changers of money sitting. He made a whip of cords, and threw all out of the temple, both the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the changers' money, and overthrew their tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, 'Take these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a marketplace.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will eat me up.'" Here are my notes for John 2:13 through 17. I had a light bulb in verse 13. We'll talk more about what the Passover is in a minute, but it is a super important celebration that comes once a year. We will see how it gets tied in with Jesus being our Passover lamb, but I'll save diving into that for later passages. However, it stood out to me here that this time Jesus goes to the temple in Jerusalem is during this important Jewish feast. Next, I have a question mark in verse 13. What is the Passover, and why is it the Passover of the Jews? This is a Jewish feast. It is a time when the Jewish people remembered when they were freed from slavery in Egypt. That's why John wrote of the Jews, which also points to the fact that this gospel is written to Gentiles who might not have been familiar with Jewish traditions and religious feasts. God was judging Egypt through many plagues, and on this night, God sent an angel of death to kill all the firstborn of the land. If the Israelites killed a spotless lamb and painted its blood on their doorframes, the angel of death would pass over their homes and their firstborns would be saved. This happened in a land where the ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh, was ordering all the firstborn males of the Israelites to be killed. So, every year, to remember this, the Jews killed a lamb and ate it to remember the night the angel of death passed over them and judged their slave masters, the Egyptians. Also, that night, the Pharaoh finally let them go, so they fled from Egypt. Another part of this feast of Passover was to eat unleavened bread. They made the bread without leaven or the yeast that makes bread rise, because they were in a hurry to leave Egypt. Eating roasted lamb, herbs, and unleavened bread helped them to remember how God saved them out of Egypt that night, and how they fled Egypt in a hurry. Exodus 12:8 says, "They shall eat the meat in that night, roasted with fire, with unleavened bread. They shall eat it with bitter herbs." We'll talk much more about this later, but it is cool to see the amazing significance in the fact that the night Jesus was betrayed and turned over to be crucified was the night he ate this Passover meal with his disciples. When we eat a meal together, which we call communion, Holy Supper, or the Lord's table, we are also remembering Jesus' sacrifice for us in his body that was broken and his blood that was shed in the bread and the cup. Passover is a big deal. Also, Jesus was in Jerusalem, where the Jewish temple was. So during this important feast of remembrance, many people would have been at the temple, which is why a lot of people were there to make money off of those visiting the temple. As we'll see, this did not sit well with Jesus. All right, I have a question mark in verse 14. Why were people in the temple selling animals and changing money, and what does it mean by people who were the changers of money? There were many people going to Jerusalem and the temple there to celebrate the important feast of Passover. At the temple, you made sacrifices. That's why people were selling animals there, for people to buy to use as their sacrificial animal. Also, they were exchanging or changing money because they had to pay a tax to visit the temple and in a special temple currency. In this way, people were making a business out of allowing people to visit the temple, and I'm sure even made money off of the unfair exchange rate I'm guessing they had for the money you gave in exchange for this temple money. None of this comes from Scripture. Okay, so I was actually wrong about that. You can find when God told people to pay like a temple tax to go, and you can find it in Exodus 30, 13 through 16, and it says, "They shall give this, everyone who passes over to those who are counted, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary." So, and it continues, and then later in Matthew 17, 24 through 27, we can see that Jesus is going to Capernaum, and people are collecting coins. So he has Peter go to the sea, cast a hook, and take up the first fish that comes up. And when he opens its mouth, he'll find a coin. Take that and give it to them. So Jesus pays this coin. So it was a thing where you do go and pay with a temple coin, pay the temple tax, or even earlier than that in Exodus, it would have been the tabernacle. But it's still clear that Jesus is mad because people are being taken advantage of. I'm putting this recording in a tiny bit later to fix this error. So when you hear me later talk about the idea of someone going to a place and your dad made this place and it was supposed to be free to enter, just think of how it should have been a certain price to enter, but then when you pay the price, you're getting ripped off and taken advantage of. All right, a little edit fix there. Jesus saw that's what was going on, knowing it was not God's will, and it made him angry, as it should. There is such a thing as righteous anger. Anger is not always bad. It should anger us when people are sinning against other people and taking advantage of them. Even more so when they're using a holy place meant to pray, offer sacrifices to God, and worship Him to make money off of people in an unfair, sleazy way. If I were in Jesus' sandals, in this moment, I might have said something like, "Are you kidding me right now?" Which leads me to my next note. I have a question mark in verse 15. Why did Jesus make a whip and pour out their money and overthrow their tables? That seems mean. Also, how is this not sinful? I thought Jesus was without sin. Some commentaries point to the fact that this whip was to drive the animals away, not just inflict violence on anyone. If that's true, it makes this easier to understand. Also, part of what we just talked about, answering my question in verse 14, might have already answered this, but let's get into it. Jesus was angry, and for good reason. Just as evil should anger us and make us want to do something about it, Jesus was righteously angry at what the people were doing in the holy Jewish temple, the place where people went to worship God. I can't think of any kind of analogy that will do this any kind of justice, but let's just say your father went to a lot of work to create a place where people could come and receive mercy, love, and help freely. It was a beautiful place that truly blessed people. Now, just as a side note, this isn't in my notes, but people did pay or, use one of their animals to make a sacrifice, and that did cost them, but it shouldn't have cost them extra just to go and visit, to exchange money for this temple coin. Anyway, let's say that this place your father built was a beautiful place that truly blessed people. And then one day you were going to visit this place only to find out that all of the people coming for assistance were being taken advantage of. Other people had come and gone against the purpose of this place, overcharging people to get in when they weren't even supposed to be charged in the first place, and making them jump through hoops to get the love and care they came for. How would that make you feel? Now, multiply that by having it be a holy place where people came to worship the one true God. You bet Jesus was angry. This was a travesty. He would not let it stand because it was beyond not okay. Maybe this story will help us relate better. Think of a doctor giving people half of the medicine they need to hopefully recover from cancer so he could make twice as much money off of them, even knowing it would kill some of them and make all of them remain sick much longer than they needed to be, if the medicine was able to do its job at half the strength? Doesn't that make you angry? Do you think your anger is misplaced? Of course not. Jesus' love for his Father and the reverence due his name drove him to be zealous for God's house. Next, I have a question mark in verse 16. What did Jesus mean by "don't make my Father's house a marketplace," and why was that bad? We've already addressed this, but something else in this verse helps us answer this. Jesus also said, "Take these things out of here." So the things people had brought into the temple to make money off of others did not belong there. They should not have been there to make money. They should not have treated the temple as a common market to profit from. Jesus was zealous for God's house to remain pure and holy. Next, I have an arrow in verses 16 and 17. Just as Jesus has a zeal for God's house, then the temple and now the church, we should too. God's house should be super important to us, and we should treat it with reverence and be zealous for it. The church is not a place for people to make money, but to come together to worship God and love and serve Him and others. Also, the church is less the place you gather and more the people who make up the gathering. So we should have great love and care for the people who make up the church and the times we gather together to worship. If your heart is not filled with expectant joy to gather with God's people, something is amiss there. It should be the highlight of your week. We worship God all week long, but there is something powerful and special about when we come together, and we must protect that to remain pure and devoted to God and His people. If Sunday gatherings are an afterthought to you, let this passage encourage you that you should have a zeal for God's house. All right, next I have a light bulb in verse 17. The disciples saw something Jesus was doing, and it reminded them of something they knew in Scripture. That shows that they saw Jesus as someone fulfilling Scripture. Jesus is this chosen one to come who the Scriptures have been referencing for hundreds of years. That is super cool and important, that the disciples were reminded of Scripture as they saw Jesus cleaning out the temple. Okay, now I have a question mark in verse 17. What's the significance of Psalm 69, verse 9, in connection with Jesus and what He did at the temple? King David wrote that psalm, and as the king to come from David, whose throne is eternal, Jesus is what David was pointing forward toward. He's living up to this promised king to come from David. As I read more commentary notes on this, it stood out to me that this cleansing of the temple had a lot of symbolic significance. It shows Jesus' authority to come and do this. Just as we'll see Jewish religious leaders ask Jesus later who gave him authority to heal people on the Sabbath day of rest, or tell people their sins are forgiven, Jesus' authority comes from God, because He comes from God and is God. Okay, I have a question mark in verse 17. What does zeal for your house mean? This word has to do with someone's enthusiasm or dedication to something. You can tell when someone is zealous for something because they're like all in about it or totally sold out about it. They're not just a fan of something, they have devotion towards it. God's house was something Jesus was zealous for, so He wasn't about to just let people mistreat it and turn it into something it's not, like a market. Okay, I have a question mark in verse 17. What does zeal for your house will eat me up mean? Other translations say will consume me. This is from Psalm 69, verse 9. David meant what I'm guessing you're already thinking, that zeal for God's house has totally taken him in. It has eaten him alive. It has captured him entirely, and he is, if I can use that word again, devoted to God's house. Mostly, I wrote this down as a question because the WEB translation, and a couple others, uses eat me up and I found that language a little confusing. Consume me is more like how we might describe this today. This concludes my notes from John 2:13 through 17. Now I invite you to pray about and think and meditate and chew on this passage and what we've talked about as I play this brief song. Okay, that's going to do it for episode 13. Before listening to episode 14, read John 2:18 through 22, hunting for notes to take using the Swedish method. And I would love to see your thoughts and notes on the episode or passage we studied in the comments section of the website or on YouTube. And that website is breakfastwiththebible.com, where you're going to find links to buy some pretty sweet merch and other ways to support the show. You can click on the coffee cup to buy me a coffee, which has a one-time donation or monthly support options, and that includes bonus content. And please drop a review of the show in your favorite place to listen to podcasts. This will really help other people find the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and tell me what you thought in the comments. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time when we'll be studying John 2:18 through 22.
Music by Dan Absalonson.